Miss Marple and the groom who vanished at the Ortada village of St. Mary Mead had never witnessed a more perfect September morning. The ancient church of St. Mary the Virgin stood resplendent in autumn sunlight, its Norman tower casting elegant shadows across the churchyard where generations of villagers lay in eternal repose. Inside, the scent of white lilies mingled with the mustiness of old prayer books, and the organ hummed with anticipation as Mrs. Caldwell, the organist for 37 years, prepared to launch into Mendelssohn's Wedding March. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary pew, third from the back on the left side, her knitting bag resting beside her sensible black shoes. Her blue eyes, remarkably sharp for a woman of her advanced years, surveyed the assembled congregation with the same gentle curiosity she might apply to observing birds in her garden. The church was filled to capacity, hardly surprising, given that the bride was Victoria Ashworth, daughter of Colonel Ashworth, the most prominent landowner in the district, and the groom was Mr. Gerald Pemberton, a rising young architect from London who had captured Victoria's heart during a house party at Ashworth Hall the previous spring. Miss Marple's nephew. The novelist Raymond West would have described the scene as positively medieval in its adherence to tradition. The bride's side of the church glittered with the cream of county society. Lady Henrietta Vane in an unfortunate hat featuring what appeared to be an entire pheasant. Mrs. Gladys Price Ridley, the vicar's wife, her face arranged in an expression of determined piety, and Miss Lavinia Pinkerton, the village's self-appointed social arbiter, whose lorgnette had been working. Over time, since the guests began arriving, the groom's side presented a more modest assemblage. Gerald Pemberton's family connections were respectable but not grander widowed mother, Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, pale and elegant in dove grey. A younger sister, Miss Sarah Pemberton, whose hands twisted nervously in her lap, and an assortment of professional colleagues and university friends who had the slightly uncomfortable air of townspeople transplanted to rural soil at precisely 11 o'clock. The church doors opened. Victoria Ashworth appeared on her father's arm, a vision in ivory silk and Brussels lace, her veil cascading from a coronet of orange blossoms. A collective sigh rippled through the congregation. Colonel Ashworth, ramrod straight in his morning coat, his military bearing unmistakable despite his 60-odd years, guided his daughter down the aisle with visible pride. Miss Marple observed them with interest. The colonel's face, weathered from years in India, showed the barely controlled emotion of a father parting with his only daughter. Victoria herself moved with surprising composure for a bride, her head held high, a small smile playing at her lips. Miss Marple noticed, with the attention to detail that had served her so well over the years, that the bride's hand on her father's arm was steady, none of the trembling one might expect. The bridal party reached the altar. The Reverend Leonard Clement, St. Mary Mead's vicar, and Miss Marple's neighbour, stood ready with his prayer book, his kindly face arranged in ceremonial solemnity. The organ music swelled to its conclusion. Colonel Ashworth stepped back, allowing his daughter to take her place beside the man who would become her husband, except there was no man. The space where Gerald Pemberton should have stood was conspicuously, impossibly empty. For several seconds, no one seemed quite able to process this absence. The congregation had been so focused on the bride's entrance that the groom's non-appearance at the altar had gone unnoticed. Now, as the reality registered, a confused murmuring began, like the first stirrings of wind before a storm. Victoria Ashworth stood frozen, her bouquet of white roses and stephanotis trembling slightly. The Reverend Clement cleared his throat, glancing about with bewilderment. Colonel Ashworth's face transformed from paternal pride to military alarm in the space of a heartbeat. "Where is Mr. Pemberton?" the vicar asked, his voice pitched low but audible in the sudden silence. The best man, a Mr. Timothy Carr who shared chambers with Pemberton in London, stepped forward from his position beside the empty space where the groom should have stood. His face had gone the colour of uncooked pastry. I don't understand, Vicar. Gerald was here 20 minutes ago. He was perfectly composed. We were in the vestry together. He said he needed a moment of fresh air before the ceremony and went out the side door. I assumed he'd come back and taken his place while I was speaking with the ushers. Fresh air. Colonel Ashworth's voice cut through the murmuring like a sabre. How long ago, man? How long has he been gone? Mr. Carr consulted his pocket watch with shaking hands. Perhaps 15 minutes. No more than 20, I swear it. 15 minutes. Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had been moving steadily throughout the ceremony's preliminaries, paused. 15 minutes was more than enough time for a man to vanish, if vanishing was his intention. But was it? That was the question. The church erupted into chaos. Women gasped and clutched their neighbors' arms. Men stood, craning their necks toward the vestry door as if Gerald Pemberton might materialize at any moment. Victoria Ashworth remained motionless at the altar, a statue in ivory silk, her face unreadable behind her veil. Colonel Ashworth took command with the efficiency of long military service. Clement, take Miss Ashworth to the vestry. Mrs. Clement, if you would accompany them. Carr, show me exactly where Pemberton went. The rest of you remain seated. This is doubtless a simple misunderstanding. But Miss Marple, observing the colonel's face as he strode toward the vestry, noted that he looked like a man preparing for battle, not for the resolution of a simple misunderstanding. She also noted, with considerable interest, the expression on Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton's face, not shock, not confusion, but something that looked remarkably like resignation, as if some long-dreaded calamity had finally arrived. The side door of the church stood open, leading to a small garden used for private contemplation. Colonel Ashworth and Mr. Carr disappeared through it, followed by several of the male guests who had elected to join the search. The minutes stretched out, marked by the relentless ticking of the church clock and the increasingly agitated whispers of the congregation. Myth. Marple's eyes travelled to Victoria Ashworth, now seated in the vestry with Mrs. Clement's arm around her shoulders. The bride had lifted her veil, and her face, visible through the vestry's half-open door, showed not tears but a peculiar blankness, as if she had retreated somewhere far beyond the reach of sympathy or shock. 10 minutes later, Colonel Ashworth returned. His face was grim. Mr. Pemberton is nowhere to be found. His hat and gloves remain in the vestry, but he himself has vanished. I've sent men to search the grounds and the village. The wedding is postponed indefinitely. The word postponed seemed inadequate to the situation, Miss Marple thought. Abandoned, perhaps, or cursed. But the colonel was a military man and accustomed to maintaining order through proper terminology. As the congregation began to disperse in clusters of urgent conversation, Miss Marple remained in her pew, her knitting needles moving once more. She was thinking of a housemaid she had employed some 40 years ago, who had accepted a proposal of marriage and then, on the wedding day itself, had discovered her intended groom fleeing out the back door of the church. That situation had involved gambling debts and a prior entanglement with a publican's daughter. But Gerald Pemberton, from all accounts, was a man of impeccable character and comfortable means. What would compel such a man to vanish at his own wedding? Unless, of course, he had not vanished voluntarily. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in the emptying church, and her gentle, observant eyes took note of everything. Who left with whom? Who looked relieved rather than shocked, and who kept glancing not toward the door through which the groom had vanished, but toward the bride who remained, frozen and silent, in her wedding dress. Something, Miss Marple thought, was very wrong indeed in St. Mary Mead. By tea-time that afternoon, every household in St. Mary Mead had formed its own theory about Gerald Pemberton's disappearance. The Blue Boar, the village's principal public house, did a roaring trade as men gathered to discuss the morning's extraordinary events over pints of bitter. The ladies congregated in drawing rooms, their teacups providing percussion to their increasingly elaborate speculations. Miss Marple, having declined several invitations to THL, extended with the transparent hope that she might provide some fresh insight, spent the afternoon in her cottage garden, ostensibly deadheading her roses, but in reality receiving a steady stream of visitors, each eager to share their particular version of events. Mrs. Price Ridley was the first to call, arriving at 3:30 with the air of one bearing momentous intelligence. "My dear Miss Marple, I felt it my duty to tell you what I observed this morning before the ceremony. I happened to be arranging the altar flowers. The girl who usually does them had made such a hash of the gladiolus. I distinctly heard raised voices from the vestry. Mr. Pemberton and another man. I'm quite certain the words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakably angry. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm as she listened. How very interesting. Did you recognize the other voice? That's just, Etty couldn't quite place it. Not the colonel, certainly. His voice carries in that military way. This was younger, more cultured. I thought perhaps Mr. Carr, the best man. But when I inquired of him, later very delicately, you understand he claimed to have been nowhere near the vestry at that time. And what time was this, precisely? Mrs. Price Ridley's certainty wavered slightly. Well, perhaps 10:30, or closer to 11:15. One loses track when one is absorbed in floral arrangements. After Mrs. Price Ridley's departure, Miss Lavinia Pinkerton arrived, her lorgnette practically quivering with importance. I've just come from Ashworth Hall, she announced, settling herself in the garden chair with the air of one prepared to hold court. Poor Victoria is prostrate, naturally. The colonel is beside himself. He's already had the police from Much Benham, though what they can do about a grown man who chooses to run away is beyond me. Cold feet, that's what this is. These modern young men have no backbone. You believe Mr. Pemberton left of his own accord. What else could it be? He seemed pleasant enough when he first came to the village, but one never really knows with these London types. The wedding was hasty, barely 6 months from engagement to ceremony. Victoria was quite swept off her feet, but I did wonder if perhaps Mr. Pemberton had rushed into things and then thought better of it. Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. Yet he went through with all the preparations. The special license, the wedding breakfast arranged at the hall, the honeymoon bookings. Those don't suggest a man with doubts. Miss Pinkerton sniffed. Men are weak creatures, Miss Marple. The thought of marriage can seem quite romantic until the actual moment arrives. The afternoon wore on. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, stopped by on his rounds and reported that Victoria Ashworth had required sedation. Shock, naturally. Though I must say, she was remarkably composed when I first saw her. Almost too composed, if you take my meaning. The hysteria came later, when she was removed from the church. Young Miss Hart, who ran the village lending library and considered herself quite modern in her views, arrived with a theory borrowed from a detective novel she'd recently read. I think Mr. Pemberton discovered some terrible secret about perhaps about her family, and couldn't go through with the marriage. The Ashworths have been in this district for generations, but who knows what skeletons might lurk in such old families. Perhaps the Colonel's time in India involved something unsavory. Or Victoria herself might have, well, one hears things about young ladies who spend time in London. Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her eyes sharpened. Did Victoria spend much time in London? Oh yes, the entire season last year. She was presented at court and everything. Quite the success, I understand, though she didn't accept any of the proposals she received. Then Mr. Pemberton appeared at the house party in May, and 6 weeks later they were engaged. Rather precipitous, don't you think? By evening, Miss Marple had heard no fewer than a dozen theories, ranging from the plausible to the fantastical. The consensus seemed to divide into two camps: those who believed Gerald Pemberton had fled due to belated doubts about the marriage, and those who suspected some darker secret had driven him away. What no one seemed to consider, Miss Marple noted, was that Gerald Pemberton might not have left voluntarily at all. She was reflecting on this over her solitary supper, when her maid, Cherry, who had been out to the village shop, returned with fresh intelligence. "They've found something, miss," Cherry announced breathlessly. "Down by the river, near the old mill. Some of Mr. Pemberton's things, his wedding ring box, and a handkerchief with his initials. And there are signs of a struggle in the mud." Miss Marple set down her teacup with great care. "A struggle? That's what they're saying. Footprints, all muddled up, and marks like something heavy was dragged. The police are there now, with lanterns, searching the riverbank." "I see," said Miss Marple quietly. "And the river at that point, is it deep?" "Deep enough to drown in, miss, if you'll pardon my saying so, especially if a person wasn't expecting to go in." Miss Marple rose from the table and moved to her sitting-room window, looking out over the darkening village. Lights were appearing in cottage windows, and she could see small groups of people hurrying toward the river path. Drawn by the terrible fascination of potential tragedy, a vanished groom was a 9 days' wonder, a source of gossip and speculation. But a murdered groom, if murder it proved to be, was something else entirely. The village's comfortable theories would have to be abandoned and harder questions asked. Who would want Gerald Pemberton dead? And more importantly, who among the wedding guests, for surely the killer had been among them, had both the opportunity and the nerve to commit murder in a church on a bright September morning? Miss Marple's mind travelled back to that moment in the church, when she had first noticed Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton's expression of resignation. A mother knew her son better than anyone. Had Mrs. Pemberton sensed some danger lurking beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect wedding day? And then there was Victoria herself, standing at the altar with that peculiar blankness on her face. Not the expression of a woman abandoned, but something else. Something that Miss Marple had seen before, though she couldn't quite place where. The telephone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was the Reverend Clement. "Miss Marple, forgive the lateness of the hour, but I thought you should know. The police have called off the river search for tonight, too dark and too dangerous. But they've asked everyone who was at the church this morning to remain available for questioning. Inspector Craddock is coming down from London tomorrow. They're treating this as suspicious circumstances now. Have they found? Miss Marple hesitated delicately. No body, if that's what you're asking. But the signs of violence are unmistakable, or so Constable Pock tells me. I'm afraid we must prepare ourselves for the worst. After the vicar rang off, Miss Marple returned to her chair and took up her knitting once more. The needles clicked steadily in the quiet room, keeping time with her thoughts. Somewhere in this village, someone knew exactly what had happened to Gerald Pemberton. Someone who had perhaps smiled and nodded during the chaos at the church, while knowing full well that the groom would never be found alive. The question was not only who had done this terrible thing, but why. And Miss Marple had learned, over many years of observation, that the why was always rooted in human nature, in jealousy, greed, fear, or revenge. Tomorrow, the police would begin their official investigation. But Miss Marple's investigation, conducted in her own quiet way, had already begun. Inspector Dermot Craddock of Scotland Yard arrived in St. Mary Mead on Monday morning, bringing with him the weight of metropolitan authority and a reputation for solving difficult cases. He was a lean man in his late 30s, with intelligent eyes and the sort of patient manner that encouraged confidences. Miss Marple had encountered him once before, during a case involving a body in a library, and had formed a favourable opinion of his abilities. The inspector had commandeered a room at the vicarage for his interviews, and by mid-morning a steady procession of witnesses had begun. Miss Marple, who happened to be delivering a jar of her homemade damson jam to Mrs. Clement, found herself in a position to observe the comings and goings with great interest. She was arranging late roses in the vicarage hall when Timothy Carr, the best man, emerged from his interview looking considerably more haggard than he had the previous morning. His collar was slightly askew, and there was a nervous energy about him that suggested sleeplessness. "Mr. Carr," Miss Marple said gently, "how very distressing this must be for you. To lose a friend in such circumstances." Carr started slightly, as if he'd forgotten anyone else might be present. Yes, it's Cy. Can't quite believe it's real, Miss Marple. Gerald and I have known each other since Cambridge. He was the steadiest man I knew. The idea that anyone would want to harm him is incomprehensible. The inspector must have asked you about the last time you saw Mr. Pemberton, over and over again. Carr passed a hand across his face. We were in the vestry together, as I told everyone yesterday. Gerald seemed perfectly normal, perhaps a touch nervous, but what groom isn't? He made some joke about married life, asked me if I had the ring, which I did, of course. Then he said he needed a few moments alone, some fresh air, and went out through the side door. I thought nothing of it. Men often need a moment to compose themselves before a wedding, and you didn't follow him. No, I was distracted by one of the ushers asking about the seating arrangements. Some confusion about Lady Vane's party. By the time I looked up, it must have been 10 minutes later. I assumed Gerald had returned and taken his place at the altar. Why would I think otherwise? Kichi. Natural, Miss Marple agreed. And during the time you and Mr. Pemberton were in the vestry together, did anyone else come in? Did you hear anything unusual? Carr's eyes shifted slightly. The vicar came in briefly, to ensure everything was ready, and I thought, but no, it was nothing. Nothing is often quite something, Miss Marple observed mildly. Well, I thought I heard voices outside the vestry window. The window was open, it was quite warm, and I heard what sounded like an argument. But when I glanced out, I saw no one. It might have been guests arriving, or villagers passing by. Could you distinguish anything that was said? But again, it might have been entirely unrelated. Miss Marple thanked him and watched as he hurried away toward the Blue Boar, where the London guests were staying. She was considering this information when Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton arrived for her appointment with the inspector, accompanied by her daughter, Sarah. The elder Mrs. Pemberton moved with the careful dignity of one holding herself together through sheer force of will. Her face was pale but composed, and she acknowledged Miss Marple with a slight nod before disappearing into the inspector's temporary office. Sarah Pemberton, however, lingered in the hallway, her hands clutching a handkerchief that was already quite damp. "I should have known," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have seen it coming." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "Seen what coming, my dear?" "That something would go wrong. Gerald has been so strange these past weeks. Not himself at all. Mother noticed it too, though she wouldn't say anything. He was distracted, anxious. When he came home from visiting the Ashworths, he'd be in such dark moods. Dark moods. But I understood he was very much in love with Miss Ashworth. Oh, he was. At first, but lately, Sarah bit her lip. I probably shouldn't say this. The inspector will think I'm being fanciful. I'm sure the inspector values all information, however fanciful it might seem, Miss Marple said encouragingly. It's just that Gerald said something odd to me last week. We were at Mother's house in London, and he'd had rather too much brandy, most unlike him. He said, "Sarah, sometimes a man finds himself in a situation where every choice leads to disaster." When I asked what he meant, he wouldn't explain. He said he'd made his bed and must lie in it, but he looked absolutely wretched. Did he seem afraid? Sarah considered this. Not afraid, exactly. More trapped. Yes, that's it. He looked like a man who'd walked into a cage and only realized it when the door locked behind him. Before Miss Marple could pursue this intriguing line of thought, Mrs. Pemberton emerged from her interview. Her face was even paler than before, and she took her daughter's arm with visible relief. "Come, Sarah, the inspector has all he needs from us, for now." As they departed, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of Inspector Craddock standing in the doorway of his temporary office. He looked troubled, and when he saw Miss Marple, he beckoned her in. "Miss Marple, I wonder if I might have a word." "Informally, you understand." "Of course, Inspector." The vicarage study had been transformed into a makeshift incident room. Papers covered the desk, and a map of the village and surrounding area had been pinned to the wall, with the church and river marked in red. "I understand you were present at the church yesterday." Craddock began, settling into the vicar's chair. "And knowing your particular talent for observation, I wondered if you noticed anything that might be relevant." Miss Marple considered. "Several things struck me as unusual, Inspector. First, Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton's reaction, or rather, her lack of surprise. When the groom failed to appear, she looked resigned rather than shocked, as if she'd been half expecting something to go wrong. Yes, I noticed that in her statement. She claims her son had seemed anxious in recent weeks, but wouldn't confide in her. Then there's the matter of Miss Ashworth's composure," Miss Marple continued. "She walked down that aisle with remarkable self-possession for a young bride, and when the groom wasn't there, her initial reaction was quite blank. The hysteria came later, as Dr. Haydock mentioned." Craddock leaned forward with interest. "You think the bride knew something?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that several people may have known something was amiss. even if they didn't know exactly what form that something would take. "We've found evidence of a violent struggle by the river," Craddock said grimly. "The mud shows signs of a fight. And we recovered not only Pemberton's ring box and handkerchief, but also a cuffling torn off in a struggle, presumably. There are drag marks leading to the water's edge, but no body, not yet. The river is being dragged, but it's deep and the current is strong. A body could be carried quite far downstream." He paused. "What troubles me, Miss Marple, is the timing. The killer must have lured Pemberton from the vestry, attacked him, and disposed of him all within a very narrow window. Everyone was gathering for the ceremony. The risk of being seen was enormous. Unless, Miss Marple suggested, the killer was someone whose presence near the church would excite no comment. Someone who had a perfectly legitimate reason to be there." "You mean someone from the wedding party itself? Don't you think that's most likely? A stranger lurking about would have been noticed immediately, but a guest or a member of the wedding party could move about quite freely." Craddock nodded slowly. "We're interviewing everyone who was present, but so far everyone claims to have been either inside the church or arriving in groups. No one admits to being near the river path around the critical time." "Someone is lying," Miss Marple said simply. "The question is who and why." The inspector shuffled through his papers. "The Ashworths are an old county family, well respected. The colonel had a distinguished military career. The daughter is considered quite a catch, attractive, accomplished, and due to inherit a substantial property. Pemberton, on the other hand, while successful in his profession, came from more modest circumstances. A good match for him, but not necessarily for her. You suspect fortune hunting. It's one possibility, though by all accounts, the young couple were genuinely attached. Multiple witnesses describe them as very much in love during their engagement. Until recently, Miss Marple murmured, thinking of Sarah Pemberton's words. "Inspector, I wonder if you might tell me something. Were there any signs that Mr. Pemberton had been robbed?" His wallet was still in his jacket pocket, in the vestry. "He was wearing his watch when he left. We know that because Mr. Carr mentioned him checking the time. We haven't found the watch, which could mean it was taken, or simply that it's still on his body somewhere in the river." "What about correspondence? Did Mr. Pemberton receive any unusual letters recently?" Craddock's eyes sharpened. "That's an interesting question. According to his mother, Gerald had been receiving letters in an unfamiliar hand. She assumed they were from Miss Ashworth, though she remarked that Victoria's handwriting on the wedding invitations looked quite different. And these letters, Gerald apparently destroyed them. His mother found ashes in his fireplace on several occasions, unusual for September." Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. "How very suggestive. A man burning letters he doesn't wish anyone to see, growing anxious and distracted, feeling trapped. These are the signs of blackmail." "Inspector, I'd reached the same conclusion," Craddock admitted. "The question is, blackmail about what? And was the blackmailer at the church yesterday?" "Oh, I think we can be quite certain of that," Miss Marple said. "Otherwise, why would Mr. Pemberton have left the vestry at such a critical moment? Someone must have sent word or given a signal that couldn't be ignored. Something urgent enough to override even the natural reluctance to leave one's own wedding ceremony. A demand for money, or a threat. Meet me now, or I'll expose your secret before the entire congregation. Something of that nature." Craddock rubbed his temples. But what secret could be worth killing over? And if Pemberton was being blackmailed, Why would he go to meet his blackmailer alone, knowing it was dangerous? Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently, because he hoped to reason with them, or because he thought he had no choice. A man who feels trapped, as Miss Sarah described, might take desperate risks. Then the blackmailer killed him rather than accept payment or negotiation. Miss Marple said the person who killed Mr. Pemberton wasn't the blackmailer at all, but someone else with an entirely different motive. Someone who took advantage of the blackmailer's summons to commit murder. Inspector Craddock looked at her with renewed respect. You're suggesting two separate plots might have been in motion. I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said, that nothing in this case is as straightforward as it appears. And in my experience, Inspector, when a murder occurs at a wedding, the motive almost always lies in either love or money, and frequently both. By Tuesday afternoon, the village had settled into an uneasy routine of speculation and investigation. The police had expanded their search along the riverbank, and divers had been brought in from much Benham, though they'd found nothing beyond a few items of clothing that might or might not have belonged to Gerald Pemberton. Miss Marple had taken advantage of the fine weather to call upon several of her acquaintances, armed with a basket of vegetables from her garden and an expression of gentle concern. It was remarkable, she reflected, how willing people were to share information. With an elderly lady engaged in charitable visiting, her first call was to Ashworth Hall, where she found Colonel Ashworth in his study, looking every one of his 63 years. Miss Marple, how kind of you to call. The Colonel rose stiffly, gesturing to a chair. Victoria is resting upstairs. The doctor has her under sedation. Damned awful business. Pardon my language. Not at all, Colonel. These are trying circumstances. I brought some vegetables from my garden. I thought your cook might find them useful. Very thoughtful. The Colonel subsided into his chair with a sigh. The police were here again this morning. That Inspector Craddock seems a capable fellow, but I can't see what more we can tell him. My daughter was as shocked as anyone by Pemberton's disappearance. Miss Marple arranged herself comfortably in her chair. It must be particularly distressing for Miss Ashworth, given the suddenness of it all. Though I understand the engagement itself was rather sudden as well. The Colonel's jaw tightened slightly. Not so sudden as all that. They met in May, became engaged in June, planned a September wedding. Perfectly respectable timeline, of course. And you approved of Mr. Pemberton. Why wouldn't I? Good family, not wealthy, but respectable. The boy had a promising career, excellent references. Victoria was mad about him, and he seemed genuinely devoted to her. I had no objections whatsoever. No objections at all, Miss Marple murmured. Then it must have come as quite a surprise when he vanished. Damned inexplicable. If the man had doubts, why not speak up before the day itself? Why put Victoria through such humiliation? The Colonel's face flushed with anger. I'll tell you frankly, Miss Marple. I hope they do find him alive, because I'd like 5 minutes alone with him to demand an explanation. You believe he left voluntarily? What else am I to think? The police talk about signs of violence, But where's the body? Where's the proof? For all we know, Pemberton staged those signs to cover his tracks. Wouldn't be the first time a man got cold feet and invented a dramatic exit. Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. But surely a man planning to flee wouldn't have gone through with all the wedding preparations. The expense alone, my expense, the Colonel interrupted bitterly. I paid for everything, as is traditional. The wedding breakfast, the church, the flowers, the honeymoon arrangements in Italy. Thousands of pounds, all wasted. If Pemberton did run off, he did so at considerable cost to me. I see. And the honeymoon arrangements, they were made by Mr. Pemberton. By both of them, I believe. Victoria was very excited about Italy. She'd never been abroad, you know. The Grand Tour, as they used to call it. Venice, Florence, Rome, all booked and paid for. A maid appeared with tea, and the conversation turned to more general topics. But Miss Marple noticed that the Colonel's hands shook slightly as he lifted his cup, and his gaze kept drifting to a photograph on his desk. Portrait of Victoria in her presentation gown from her London season, after taking her leave of Ashworth Hall. Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the village, pausing occasionally to admire gardens or exchange greetings with neighbours. She was thus perfectly positioned to encounter Mr. Timothy Carr as he emerged from the chemist's shop, looking distinctly unwell. "Mr. Carr, are you quite all right?" "Miss Marple, yes, I'm fine. Just a headache. I haven't been sleeping well." "How very understandable. Might I walk with you a little way? I find the afternoon air so beneficial for headaches." They strolled together toward the Blue Boar, and Miss Marple inquired gently about the progress of the investigation. "The inspector questioned me again this morning," Carr said wearily. "He seems particularly interested in Gerald's state of mind in the weeks before the wedding. I've told him everything I know, but I'm not sure how helpful it is. You mentioned yesterday that Mr. Pemberton had seemed anxious recently." "Yes, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Gerald was always rather private about personal matters. We were close friends, but he didn't confide everything." Carr hesitated, then added, "There was one thing, though it may mean nothing. About a month ago, Gerald and I met for dinner at our club in London. He'd had several drinks unusual for him, and he said something odd. He asked me if I thought a man could ever truly escape his past, or if sins always caught up with one eventually." Miss Marple's interest quickened. "Did he elaborate?" "No, I made some joke about it, assumed he was being philosophical. But looking back, I wonder if he was trying to tell me something. If there was something in his past that was troubling him, and you mentioned nothing of this to the police." Carr flushed slightly. "I didn't want to blacken Gerald's name with vague hints. If there's no body, then perhaps he did leave voluntarily, and whatever troubled him was his own business. But if he is dead, if he was murdered, then I suppose anything might be relevant." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "Tell me, did Mr. Pemberton ever mention receiving any unusual correspondence?" "Funny you should ask that. Yes, there were several occasions when letters arrived that clearly disturbed him. He'd read them and then become very quiet and withdrawn. When I asked about them, he'd say they were business matters, but they didn't look like business letters. The handwriting was too distinctive, rather old-fashioned, all flourishes and loops. And you never saw who these letters were from. No return address, at least not that I noticed. But Gerald always destroyed them. He was quite particular about that." They had reached the Blue Boar, and Carr excused himself, citing his headache. Miss Marple continued her walk, her mind working methodically through the emerging pattern, A young man receiving mysterious letters that disturbed him. A man feeling trapped, speaking of sins and the past catching up. A man who appeared devoted to his fiancée, but grew increasingly anxious as the wedding approached. And finally, a man who left his own wedding ceremony to meet someone by the river, someone who either killed him or witnessed his death. The puzzle was beginning to take shape, though crucial pieces remained missing. Miss Marple's afternoon calls also included a visit to Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, who was staying with her daughter at a cottage on the edge of the village. She found the two women in a state of controlled grief, maintaining their composure through evident effort. "We're returning to London tomorrow," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice tight. "There's nothing more we can do here, and the waiting is unbearable. The inspector has our address if he needs us further." "I'm so sorry for your loss," Miss Marple said gently, "though I understand no body has been found. But we must face reality, Miss Marple. Those signs of violence, the blood on the handkerchief Gerald would never have left voluntarily. He was killed, and whoever did it is still walking free, probably laughing at us all." Sarah Pemberton, who had been silent until now, spoke suddenly. "It's my fault. I should have insisted he tell me what was wrong. I knew something was troubling him desperately, but I didn't push. I thought it was just wedding nerves, or perhaps some conflict with the ash. If I'd been more persistent, you mustn't blame yourself," her mother said firmly. "Gerald was a grown man. If he chose to keep secrets, that was his decision. But what secrets could he have had?" Sarah cried. "Gerald was the most straightforward person I knew. He didn't gamble, didn't keep mistresses, wasn't involved in anything shady. What could possibly have driven him to whatever happened by that river?" Miss Marple spoke very quietly. "Sometimes the secrets that destroy us aren't our own, but others. Perhaps Mr. Pemberton learnt something he wasn't meant to know. Something dangerous." Mrs. Pemberton's face went even paler. "You mean blackmail? Gerald being blackmailed? Or Gerald knowing something that made him a threat to someone else? But who?" Everyone at that wedding was respectable, well known. The idea that one of them could be a murderer is unthinkable. Murder, Miss Marple observed, is always unthinkable until it happens. And in my experience, the most respectable people are often quite capable of terrible things when sufficiently motivated. That evening, as Miss Marple sat in her cottage reviewing the day's gleanings, she made a list in her neat handwriting. Asterisk, known facts, Gerald. Pemberton received mysterious letters in distinctive handwriting. He spoke of feeling trapped and of sins catching up. He grew increasingly anxious as wedding approached. He left vestry suddenly, suggesting urgent summon signs of violent struggle by river. No body recovered. Ring box and handkerchief found. Watch missing. Suspicious circumstances. Mrs. Pemberton's resignation. Rather than shock Victoria Ashworth's initial composure, Colonel Ashworth's anger, guilt, or genuine outrage. Timothy Carr's fragmentary, knowledge destroyed, letters overheard, argument in near vestry questions. Who wrote the letters? What was Gerald's secret, if any? Who benefits from his death? Who had opportunity and means? Asterisk, the last question was particularly important. Inspector Craddock was quite right about the timing. The window of opportunity was extraordinarily narrow. Someone had lured Gerald from the vestry, killed him, and disposed of him all while a church full of people waited for the ceremony to begin. That suggested someone who knew the church grounds intimately. Someone who knew exactly where to go to avoid being seen. Someone who had planned this carefully, perhaps for weeks, and someone, Miss Marple thought, who might not have been working alone. Wednesday morning brought rain to St. Mary Mead, a steady drizzle that turned the village high street into a series of puddles and scent. Everyone scurrying between shops with upturned collars and hastily opened umbrellas. Miss Marple, who rarely allowed weather to interfere with her habits, made her way to the church for the weekly flower arrangement duties, her waterproof cape and stout shoes serving her well. She found the Reverend Clement in the vestry, looking troubled. "Miss Marple, thank goodness you're here. I've been going over the events of Saturday morning, and something has been nagging at me. I wondered if I might have your opinion." "Of course, Vic." Clement gestured to the vestry, which had been restored to its usual order after the police examination. "The inspector keeps asking about the timeline, you see. He wants to know precisely when everyone was where. And I've been trying to remember my own movements, but there's a gap that bothers me." "A gap?" "Yes, I was in the vestry with Mr. Pemberton and Mr. Carr around 10:30. We reviewed the ceremony, checked that everything was in order. Then I left to greet arriving guests in the church. I must have been doing that for 20 minutes perhaps. When I returned to the vestry to collect my prayer book, Mr. Carr was there, but Mr. Pemberton had gone. Carr said he'd stepped out for air, and I thought nothing of it. This is all in your statement to the police, I imagine." "Yes. But here's what's been troubling me. When I came back to the vestry that second time, I noticed something out of place. A prayer book, not mine, a different one, lying open on the table. It's the sort of detail one notices automatically when one has organized these books for 40 years. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. A prayer book that shouldn't have been there. Precisely. We keep spare prayer books in the church itself, in the pew racks. There's no reason for one to be in the vestry, and it was lying open as if someone had been reading it tore, as if something had been placed inside it. Do you still have this prayer book? That's the odd thing. When I looked for it later, after all the confusion, it was gone. Someone must have taken it, or returned it to the church." Clement nodded slowly. "I suppose so. But why bring it to the vestry in the first place?" Miss Marple considered this. "Vicar, if someone wanted to pass a message to Mr. Pemberton without being observed, what better method than to place a note inside a prayer book? He could retrieve it privately, read it, and no one would notice anything amiss. A secret message, but from whom? That," said Miss Marple, "is the question we must answer." She asked permission to examine the church, and Clement readily agreed. Together they walked through the dim interior, their footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The rain pattered against the stained glass windows, casting shifting patterns of colored light across the pews. Miss Marple moved slowly along the pew racks, examining the prayer books. They were old, well-worn volumes, their pages softened by decades of use. She was looking for something specific, though she couldn't have said exactly what. In the third pew from the back. On the right side, the groom's side, she found it. The prayer book there was slightly askew in its holder, as if hastily replaced. When Miss Marple drew it out, she noticed immediately that several pages were dog-eared in a way that suggested recent handling. More significantly, between two of these pages, she found a faint pencil mark, almost erased but still visible under close scrutiny. The mark was on a page containing the marriage ceremony. Specifically, it marked the passage, If any of you know cause, or just impediment, why these two persons should not be joined together. Miss Marple showed this to the vicar, who looked puzzled. What could this mean? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that someone was considering making an objection to the marriage, or perhaps threatening to do so. But no one objected. The ceremony never reached that point. No, because Mr. Pemberton disappeared before it could. Miss Marple continued her examination of the church, noting small details that others might have overlooked. In the small garden outside the side door, the door through which Gerald Pemberton had made his final exits, she found something that made her pause despite the rain. A button, a small, distinctive button covered in dark blue silk, half buried in the mud near the doorframe. It was the sort of button one might find on a lady's jacket or dress, expensive, decorative rather than functional. She picked it up, carefully wrapping it in her handkerchief, and showed it to the vicar. I don't recognize it, Clement admitted, though it looks like quality workmanship, perhaps from a wedding guest's outfit. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, or perhaps from the outfit of someone who wasn't supposed to be in this garden at all. When Inspector Craddock arrived at the vicarage later that morning, Miss Marple was waiting for him with her findings. She explained about the prayer book and showed him the button. Craddock examined both items with interest. The prayer book message, if that's what it was, suggests premeditation. Someone planned to communicate with Pemberton during the ceremony itself, and succeeded in luring him out of the vestry at the critical moment. But who and how did they know he would check the prayer book? I think, Miss Marple said, that Mr. Pemberton may have received similar messages before, perhaps during his previous visits to St. Mary Mead. During the engagement period, he would have learned to look for them. A secret correspondence conducted through prayer books in a church, Craddock mused. It's almost romantic, in a macabre sort of way. Or desperate. Someone who couldn't risk being seen communicating with Mr. Pemberton directly. Craddock pulled out his notebook. I've been building a timeline based on witness statements. Colonel Ashworth and his daughter arrived at the church at 10:45, went immediately to the bride's preparation room. Mrs. Pemberton and her daughter arrived about the same time, were shown to the front pews. The various guests arrived in dribs and drabs between 10:30 and 10:55. By 11 o'clock, everyone was seated and waiting for the ceremony to begin. And Mr. Pemberton? He and Mr. Carr arrived at 10:20, went straight to the vestry. According to Carr, Pemberton seemed nervous, but not unusually so. The vicar joined them briefly at 10:30, then left to greet guests. At approximately 10:45, Pemberton told Carr he needed fresh air and exited through the side door. That's the last time anyone admits to seeing him alive. Approximately 10:45, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. That was precisely when the church was filling with guests. Maximum distraction, minimum chance of anyone noticing comings and goings. Except someone must have been watching and waiting for Pemberton to emerge. Someone who was ready to intercept him. Miss Marple held up the button. Inspector, I think you should compare this with the outfits worn by the wedding guests, particularly the female guests. You think a woman killed him. I think a woman may have lured him to his death. Whether she wielded the weapon herself or had an accomplice is another matter. Craddock looked at her with respect. You've been thinking about this. I've been remembering similar cases from my own experience. Human nature, Inspector, is remarkably consistent. When a man is killed just before his wedding, one must look at three possibilities: a rejected lover, a secret from his past, or someone who benefits from the marriage not taking place, or all three combined. Precisely that afternoon, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Miss Sarah Pemberton appeared at her cottage door, her face drawn and her manner agitated. "Miss Marple, I hope you'll forgive my calling without notice. I'm leaving for London this evening, but I had to speak with you first. There's something I didn't tell the inspector, and it's been weighing on my conscience." Miss Marple settled her guest in the sitting room and provided tea. "What is it, my dear?" Sarah twisted her handkerchief between her hands. "It's about Victoria Ashworth. I'm not certain, I may be quite wrong, but I think she and Gerald had quarrelled shortly before the wedding." "What makes you think so?" "I visited Gerald at his London flat 2 weeks before the wedding. I brought him some things from Mother. While I was there, a telegram arrived from Victoria. Gerald read it and went absolutely white. He said something under his breath. I couldn't catch all of it, but I heard the words 'too late now' and 'trapped.' Did you see the telegram?" "No." Gerald folded it up immediately and put it in his pocket, but his hands were shaking. I asked if everything was all right, and he said, of course, just wedding nerves. But I didn't believe him. "Did you tell your mother about this?" "Yes, and she advised me to say nothing. She thought I must have misunderstood, that it would be cruel to suggest anything was wrong with Gerald's engagement when he was no longer here to explain himself. But Miss Marple, what if that telegram contained some threat? What if Victoria, she—" broke off, unable to articulate the terrible suspicion. Miss Marple spoke gently. "You think Miss Ashworth might have been blackmailing your brother? I don't know what to think. But Gerald changed after he met her. He became secretive, anxious, and the engagement was so rushed. What if she had some hold over him? What if she forced him to propose? That's a very serious accusation, Miss Pemberton." "I know. That's why I haven't told the police. I have no proof, only feelings and half-heard words. But you seem to understand these things, Miss Marple. You notice what others miss. I thought perhaps you could determine if my suspicions have any foundation." After Sarah left, Miss Marple sat for a long time in thought. A telegram, sent 2 weeks before the wedding, that had distressed Gerald Pemberton profoundly. A bride who walked down the aisle with unusual composure. A groom who spoke of being trapped. The picture was becoming clearer, though it raised as many questions as it answered. What could Victoria Ashworth have held over Gerald Pemberton? What secret could be so damaging that he would choose marriage or even death rather than risk? Its exposure, Miss Marple reached for her knitting, her needles clicking steadily as she considered the possibilities. In her experience, the secrets that destroyed young people most thoroughly were often connected to scandal, impropriety, or social disgrace. In the rigid social structure of their class, certain revelations could ruin a person completely. But what revelation? And how did it connect to the murder by the river? The rain continued to fall, and Miss Marple continued to knit and to think. Thursday brought an unexpected development. Miss Marple learned of it from Dr. Haydock, who stopped by her cottage after his morning rounds, looking uncommonly serious. "I've just come from Ashworth Hall," he said without preamble. "Victoria Ashworth attempted to take her own life last night. Laudanum. Her maid found her in time, thank God, but it was a near thing. Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. How is she now? Physically, she'll recover. Mentally and emotionally, that's another matter. She's been sedated again, but before she lost consciousness, she kept repeating something odd. She said, "I never meant for him to die. I only wanted him to marry me." Did the inspector hear this? He was summoned immediately. He's at the hall now, waiting to question her when she wakes. But Miss Marple, what could she have meant? If she wanted Pemberton to marry her, why would she have anything to do with his death? Perhaps, Miss Marple said slowly, because wanting something and achieving it are two very different things. And sometimes, in trying to force a desired outcome, one sets in motion events that spiral beyond control. She accompanied Dr. Haydock to Ashworth Hall, where they found Inspector Craddock in conference with Colonel Ashworth. The colonel looked as if he had aged 10 years overnight. "The inspector seems to think my daughter is somehow involved in Pemberton's disappearance," he said heavily. "It's preposterous. Victoria loved the man. She's been beside herself with grief." "Or guilt," Craddock suggested quietly. "Colonel, I need to know the truth about your daughter's relationship with Mr. Pemberton. How did they actually meet? What were the circumstances of their engagement?" The colonel sighed deeply. "Very well. If it must be told, then you shall hear it. But you must understand, I was trying to protect Victoria's reputation." He gestured them to seats and began his account. Gerald Pemberton first met Victoria not in May at a house party, as we told everyone, but in February in London. Victoria was attending a party, a rather bohemian affair, not the sort of thing I would have approved had I known about it. There was drinking, and worse. Victoria, inexperienced in such matters, found herself in a compromising situation. Mr. Pemberton, who was there by accident a friend, had brought him in. He helped Victoria leave before anything truly ruinous occurred. "I see," said Craddock. "And then?" Victoria was grateful, naturally. She began corresponding with Pemberton. I knew nothing of this. When I finally learned of it in April, I was furious. The secrecy, the impropriety of a young lady writing to a man without her father's knowledge or approval, it was unthinkable. "But you permitted the engagement," Miss Marple observed. The colonel's face darkened. "I had little choice. Victoria informed me that she had reason to believe she might be expecting a child." A heavy silence fell over the room. She claimed, the colonel continued with difficulty, that she and Pemberton had been intimate. "Just once," she said, in a moment of passion and gratitude. She insisted they must marry immediately. Pemberton, when I confronted him, didn't deny it. He agreed to marry Victoria without hesitation. "Did you believe your daughter's story?" Craddock asked. "What else was I to believe?" She seemed genuinely distressed, and Pemberton's willingness to marry her seemed to confirm it. So I agreed to the engagement. We invented the story about the house party meeting to save Victoria's reputation, and we arranged for a quick wedding. And was Miss Ashworth actually with child? The colonel shook his head. She claimed to have been mistaken. These things happen, I'm told, with young women. False alarms due to stress or wishful thinking. Miss Marple's needles had gone still. Or deliberate deception. The colonel stared at her. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting, Colonel, that your daughter may have fabricated the entire story to force Mr. Pemberton into marriage. That's monstrous. Why would she do such a thing?" "Because," Miss Marple said gently, "she was desperately in love with him, and he was not in love with her. or not sufficiently to propose marriage of his own accord. Craddock leaned forward. Colonel, I need you to think carefully. When you confronted Pemberton with your daughter's claims, how did he react? He was shocked, naturally, but he accepted responsibility. He said that if Victoria believed they must marry, then marry they would. He was quite adamant about doing the right thing. But did he seem like a man who remembered being intimate with your daughter, or like a man who was confused but too honorable to deny it? The colonel's face went pale as he considered this. There was something odd about his response, now that you mention it. He kept saying, if Victoria says it happened, then it must have, rather than simply confirming it himself. I thought at the time he was being discreet, but now I wonder. You wonder if he genuinely didn't remember, Craddock finished. Perhaps because it never happened, or because something happened at that party in February that he doesn't recall. Clearly something that made him vulnerable to manipulation. At that moment, the doctor emerged from Victoria's room. She's awake and asking to speak with the inspector. But I warn you, she's very fragile. Don't push her too hard. Victoria Ashworth lay propped against white pillows, her face nearly as pale as the linen. But her eyes, when they met Craddock's, were clear and filled with a terrible resignation. I'll tell you everything, she said quietly. There's no point in hiding it now. I killed him not with my own hands, but I killed him nonetheless. Miss Marple, who had been permitted to stay at Dr. Haydock's insistence, moved closer to the bed. Miss Ashworth, what happened at that party in February? Victoria's eyes filled with tears. I saw Gerald across the room, and I fell in love instantly. Completely. It sounds foolish, I know, but I'd never felt anything like it. He was so handsome, so kind. He helped me when some drunken man became too insistent. He saw me safely to a cab. I hoped he felt something too, but he didn't. He was grateful for the opportunity to help. That was all. He saw me as a child who needed rescuing, not as a woman he could love. After that night, I wrote to him. He responded politely but distantly. When he stopped responding altogether, I became desperate. So you invented the story about the intimacy and the pregnancy, Craddock said. Yes, I thought if I could just get him to marry me, he would learn to love me. I thought I could make him happy, given time. But I had to act quickly before he met someone else. So I told father the lie, knowing he would demand Gerald marry me to preserve my honor. And Mr. Pemberton agreed. He had no choice. Father threatened to ruin him professionally if he refused. And Gerald was too honorable to deny something he couldn't remember clearly. The party had been substances there, things that affected people's memories. I suggested to Gerald that perhaps something had happened between us that he didn't recall. He was confused, uncertain. Eventually, he accepted that it must be true. But he didn't remember it, Miss Marple said softly. No. And as the wedding approached, he began to receive letters, anonymous letters, suggesting that I had lied, that the whole thing was a plot to trap him. The letters urged him to investigate, to demand proof before going through with the marriage. Who sent these letters? Craddock demanded. Victoria's face crumpled. I don't know. That's the terrible truth. I don't know who knew about my deception and was trying to expose it. The letters frightened Gerald terribly. He confronted me several times, asking if I was certain about what had happened in February. I maintained the lie, but I could see him doubting, questioning everything. Did he threaten to cancel the wedding? No, he said he'd made a commitment and would honor it, but he looked so trapped, so miserable. I told myself he'd be happy once we were married, but I knew I was deceiving myself as much as him. Then, on Saturday morning, he received another message. I saw it being delivered, a note brought by a village child, who said a lady had paid him 6pence to deliver it. Gerald read it and went white. He told Mr. Carr he needed air, and he left. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. What did the note say? Craddock asked urgently. I don't know. Gerald destroyed it before he left. But I think someone asked him to meet them. Someone who promised to show him proof that I had lied. And when he went to that meeting, she broke off, sobbing. Miss Marple spoke very gently. You think someone killed him to prevent him from learning the truth and cancelling the wedding? Yes. Or perhaps someone wanted to punish me for what I'd done. Perhaps someone who cared about Gerald and knew he was being manipulated into a loveless marriage. But who? Who would care that much? Inspector Craddock exchanged glances with Miss Marple. The answer to that question was suddenly, devastatingly clear. Someone who loved Gerald Pemberton enough to kill rather than see him trapped in a fraudulent marriage. Someone who had been at the church, who had access to the prayer books, who could move about the grounds without exciting suspicion. But who? That was the final piece of the puzzle they still needed to fit into place. By Friday morning, the investigation had reached a critical juncture. Inspector Craddock had taken Victoria Ashworth's statement and was now focused on identifying the writer of the anonymous letters. The distinctive handwriting that Mrs. Pemberton had mentioned, old-fashioned. All flourishes and loops became a crucial clue. Miss Marple was in her garden, ostensibly pruning roses, but actually deep in thought. When Cherry appeared with news, Miss, there's been a discovery. They've found Mr. Pemberton's watch not in the river at all, but in the church organ loft. Mrs. Caldwell found it this morning when she went to practice for Sunday service. The organ loft. Miss Marple's interest sharpened immediately. How extraordinary. What was it doing there? That's what everyone's asking. The inspectors at the church now, examining it. They're saying it means Mr. Pemberton never made it to the river at all, that everything by the riverbank was staged to mislead the investigation. Miss Marple set down her pruning shears with decision. I believe I should pay my respects to the vicar. He must be quite distressed by all this commotion in his church. At the church, she found Inspector Craddock in the organ loft with Mrs. Caldwell, a thin, nervous woman who had been the church organist for nearly 4 decades. I nearly fainted when I saw it. I don't mind telling you, Mrs. Caldwell was saying, just lying there on the bench beside the music. I knew it was his watch because of the initials on it, GP, and there's blood on the chain. Just a few drops, but definite blood. Miss Marple climbed the narrow stairs to the loft, no easy task, but she managed it with her usual quiet determination. The organ loft was a small space, crowded with the massive organ pipes and offering a clear view down into the church below. Inspector, she said, slightly breathless from the climb, may I ask when Mrs. Caldwell last used the organ before the wedding? Friday afternoon, Craddock replied. She practiced for about an hour, she says, and there was definitely no watch here then, so it was placed here sometime between Friday afternoon and this morning. More specifically, Craddock said, it was likely placed here on Saturday during the wedding chaos. When everyone was distracted by Pemberton's disappearance, someone slipped up here and left the watch. But why? Mrs. Caldwell asked, bewildered. What would be the point? Miss Marple examined the watch carefully without touching it. The blood, as Mrs. Caldwell had said, was minimal, just a few drops on the chain. Not the amount one would expect from a violent death. "I think," she said slowly, "this watch is telling us that Mr. Pemberton never left the church at all. Or if he did, he returned. And whatever happened to him happened here, not by the river." Craddock frowned. "But the evidence by the river, the struggle, the drag marks, was staged, as your team has begun to suspect. Someone wanted us to believe Mr. Pemberton was killed by the river and his body carried away by the current. But in reality, he died here, in this church, and his body is still somewhere on these grounds." The implications hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Caldwell gasped and had to be helped to a chair. "But where?" Craddock demanded. "We've searched this church thoroughly. There's nowhere to hide a body." "Nowhere obvious," Miss Marple agreed, "which suggests somewhere not obvious. Tell me, Inspector, how well do you know the history of this church? It's Norman, isn't it? Quite old, very old. And like many ancient churches, it has features that have been forgotten over the centuries. Priest holes, crypts, passages. During the Reformation and the Civil War, such hiding places were common. The Reverend Clement, who had been summoned by arrived at this juncture and confirmed Miss Marple's observation. "There is a crypt beneath the church," he said. "It hasn't been opened in my time. Here the entrance is behind the altar, concealed by a memorial stone. It was used for important burials centuries ago, but in Victorian times it was sealed up. Health concerns about old corpses, I believe. Can it be opened?" Craddock asked urgently. "Yes, though it will require some effort. The stone is quite heavy." Within the hour, a crew had assembled to move the memorial stone. It scraped across the floor with a sound that made everyone wince, revealing a narrow stairway descending into darkness. Inspector Craddock descended first with a torch, followed by Dr. Haydock and several constables. Miss Marple remained above, but she could hear their exclamations and knew what they had found even before they emerged with grim faces. "He's there," Craddock said quietly. "Gerald Pemberton, dead for days, by the look of him. Struck on the back of the head with something. Heavy, probably the brass candlestick that's lying beside him. Dr. Haydock estimates he's been dead since Saturday morning." The church erupted into controlled chaos. The crypt was declared a crime scene. Photographers and police surgeons were summoned from Much Benham, and a thorough search of the entire church began anew. Miss Marple, however, was focused on a different question. She approached Mrs. Caldwell, who was being comforted by several women from the parish. "Mrs. Caldwell, I wonder if you might help me with something. Who, besides yourself and the vicar, has keys to the church?" Mrs. Caldwell dabbed at her eyes. "Well, there's Mr. Weatherby, the verger, and Colonel Ashworth, and Mrs. Price Ridley has one for her flower arrangement duties. I think that's Allo and Lady Vane, because she donates so much to the Restoration Fund." The vicar felt she should have access whenever she wished. Miss Marple noted these names carefully. Any one of these people could have entered the church before or after the ceremony to hide Gerald Pemberton's body, assuming they were strong enough to move it, or had help. That afternoon brought another revelation, this time from Timothy Carr. He appeared at the vicarage looking haggard and desperate, demanding to speak with Inspector Craddock immediately. "I can't keep silent any longer," he said. "I've been wrestling with my conscience for days. But now that Gerald's body has been found, I must tell you what I know. Craddock led him into the study. With Miss Marple present at Carr's insistence, Gerald was being blackmailed, Carr said without preamble. He told me about it 3 weeks before the wedding. Someone had learned about an incident from his past, something that happened when he was at Cambridge. What sort of incident? Carr hesitated. There was a young woman, the sister of one of Gerald's friends. She became infatuated with Gerald, pursued him relentlessly. Gerald tried to discourage her gently, but she was persistent. Then, one night at a party, she claimed Gerald had forced his attentions on her. It was completely false, but the scandal could have destroyed Gerald's reputation and career. The matter was hushed up, the girl was sent abroad, and everyone agreed to forget it happened. But someone didn't forget, Miss Marple said. Exactly. Someone found out and began sending Gerald letters, demanding money to keep silent. Gerald paid at first, but the demands kept increasing. By the time of the wedding, he was nearly financially ruined. He told me he couldn't go on, that he had to find out who was blackmailing him and stop it somehow. Did he suspect anyone? He thought, and I know this sounds mad, he thought, it might be connected to Victoria Ashworth somehow. Not that she was the blackmailer, but that someone close to her was using the information to ensure the marriage went forward. Someone who wanted Victoria married to him, perhaps for their own reasons. Craddock leaned forward intently. Did Gerald tell you he was planning to confront someone on Saturday morning? Yes, he said he'd received another letter, asking him to meet at the church before the ceremony. The letter promised to reveal the blackmailer's identity, and offered him a way out, some evidence that would free him from both the blackmail and the marriage. Gerald was desperate enough to believe it. He thought if he could just get this evidence, he could cancel the wedding and save himself. But it was a trap, Miss Marple said softly. It must have been. Someone lured him to that meeting, struck him down, and hid his body in the crypt. Then they staged the evidence by the river to make it look like he'd fled and been murdered elsewhere. It was all calculated to give the killer time to escape detection after Carr left. Craddock turned to Miss Marple with frustration evident on his face. We have multiple possible suspects, multiple motives, and still no clear proof of who actually wielded that candlestick. Victoria Ashworth wanted the marriage to proceed. Could she have killed him when he threatened to expose her lies? Mrs. Pemberton or Sarah might have killed him to free him from the marriage. Even Colonel Ashworth might have done it if he learned. Victoria had lied and wanted to preserve his family's honor by eliminating the problem. And we haven't even fully investigated the other wedding guests, I think. Miss Marple said carefully that you're looking at this from the wrong angle, Inspector. What do you mean? You're asking who killed Gerald Pemberton. But the more important question is, who wrote the letters? Who was blackmailing him? Find that person, and you'll find your murderer, or at least discover who set the events in motion that led to murder. The handwriting, Craddock muttered. Old-fashioned, all flourishes and loops. We need to compare handwriting samples from everyone involved. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. But I think we should also consider something else. The person who wrote those letters knew intimate details about Gerald's past details. And why did they wait until now, until Gerald's engagement, to use them? Craddock's eyes widened. You think the blackmailer was connected to the original incident at Cambridge? Perhaps the young woman herself, or someone acting on her behalf. Or someone who recently learned about it and saw an opportunity, Miss Marple suggested. Someone who needed money, perhaps. Or someone who wanted to control Gerald Pemberton for their own purposes. As evening fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple returned to her cottage with much to ponder. The case was becoming clearer, but crucial pieces still needed to fall into place. She was certain now that she knew who had killed Gerald Pemberton, or, at least, she knew how to prove it. But proof and certainty were different things, and the proof she needed would require a carefully laid trap of her own. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, as if the previous week's dramatic events had never occurred. Miss Marple, however, knew that the real drama was yet to come. She had spent much of Friday evening in consultation with Inspector Craddock, and together they had devised a plan that would, she hoped, force the murderer's hand. The plan required the cooperation of several key individuals, and Miss Marple's first task was to secure it. She began with a visit to Ashworth Hall, where she found Colonel Ashworth in his study, looking older and more defeated than ever. "Colonel, I wonder if I might ask a great favor of you. It concerns your daughter's safety." His head snapped up. "Victoria, is she in danger?" "I believe she may be, yes. The person who killed Mr. Pemberton is still at large and may feel threatened by what Victoria knows, what they think she knows. But Victoria has already told the inspector everything. She has nothing more to reveal. Perhaps, but the murderer may not be certain of that. I'd like to suggest that we arrange a small gathering, just the principals in this case, where certain revelations can be made safely with the police present." The Colonel frowned. "What sort of revelations?" "The identity of the person who wrote those blackmail letters to Mr. Pemberton. I believe I know who it was, but I need to provide them an opportunity to incriminate themselves." After some persuasion, the Colonel agreed. Similar conversations with Mrs. Pemberton, Sarah, Timothy Carr, and several others followed. By afternoon, Inspector Craddock had arranged for a gathering at the vicarage on Saturday evening, ostensibly to allow everyone to hear the official conclusion of the police investigation and to put the matter to rest. When the group assembled in the vicarage's largest drawing room that evening, the atmosphere was tense. Present were Colonel Ashworth and Victoria, who had been judged well enough to attend, Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton and Sarah, Timothy Carr, Lady Henrietta Vane, Miss Lavinia Pinkerton, and the verger, Mr. Weatherby. The Reverend and Mrs. Clement played host, while Inspector Craddock stood near the fireplace with his notebook in hand. Miss Marple had positioned herself in a chair near the window, her knitting in her lap, looking like nothing more than a harmless elderly lady who happened to be present. Craddock began with a summary of the known facts. Gerald Pemberton's disappearance on his wedding day, the staged evidence by the river, the discovery of his body in the church crypt, the blow to the head that had killed him. He spoke of the blackmail letters, the false pregnancy claim, the desperate attempt to force a marriage. "What we have here," Craddock said, "is a complex web of deception and desperation. Multiple people had motives to want Mr. Pemberton dead. Victoria Ashworth wanted to preserve her, fraudulent claim and ensure the marriage proceeded. Mrs. Pemberton, or her daughter, might have wanted to free Gerald from an unwanted marriage. Mr. Carr was Gerald's closest friend and might have acted to protect him. Even Colonel Ashworth had reason to feel betrayed when he learned his daughter had lied. This is outrageous." The Colonel sputtered. "You can't seriously suggest—" "Please, Colonel, let me finish. The key to solving this murder lay not in the wedding day itself, but in the weeks and months preceding it. Someone was systematically blackmailing Gerald Pemberton, using knowledge of an old scandal to extort money and control his actions. We believe this same person lured him to his death." Victoria spoke up, her voice trembling. "But I've told you, I don't know who sent those letters. I received no benefit from the blackmail. Gerald never gave me any money, and I certainly didn't want him terrified and miserable." "Quite so," Craddock agreed. "Which suggests the blackmailer had a different agenda than simply supporting your fraudulent marriage claim. Miss Marple, perhaps you'd like to explain your theory." All eyes turned to Miss Marple, who set down her knitting with a gentle smile. "It's really quite simple when one considers human nature," she began in her soft, diffident voice. "I was reminded of a case many years ago involving a housemaid who became obsessed with a young man who was engaged to another woman. The housemaid couldn't bear to see him marry someone else, but she also couldn't bring herself to let him go free. So she devised a plot to destroy both his marriage and, ultimately, him." She paused, her eyes moving around the room, observing reactions. "In this case, we have a similar situation. Someone who cared deeply for Gerald Pemberton, perhaps even loved him, but who couldn't have him for themselves. This person learned of his entanglement with Victoria Ashworth and recognized it as a false trap. Rather than free Gerald immediately, however, this person saw an opportunity to make themselves indispensable to him, to position themselves as his only hope of escape." The blackmailer, Timothy Carr, breathed. "Precisely. The blackmail wasn't about money, it was about control and connection. By threatening to expose an old scandal, the blackmailer ensured that Gerald would have to communicate with them, confide in them, rely on them. The blackmailer may even have believed that eventually Gerald would turn to them for comfort and support, and perhaps love would grow from that." Mrs. Pemberton spoke sharply. "This is all very theoretical, Miss Marple, but who are you accusing?" Miss Marple's eyes settled on one person in the room. The handwriting on the letters was described as old-fashioned, with elaborate flourishes and loops. This is the handwriting style taught in young ladies' academies several decades ago. It would be unusual in someone of Gerald's generation, but quite natural in someone older who had learned their script in a more formal era. Sarah Pemberton gasped. "Mother, are you saying my mother?" "No, my dear. Your mother's handwriting, which I've seen on the sympathy cards she sent around the village, is quite modern and plain. But there is someone else here whose handwriting matches that description perfectly. Someone who had access to the church, who could move about freely without exciting suspicion, and who had been in love with Gerald Pemberton for a very long time." Miss Marple's gaze fixed on Lady Henrietta Vane, who had gone very pale. "Lady Vane, you were at that Cambridge party where the scandal involving Gerald originated, weren't you? You were a guest of the Masters family, your cousin, I believe. You witnessed what really happened with the young woman who accused Gerald. You knew he was innocent, and over the years, you observed his life from a distance, perhaps cherishing a hopeless affection for him." Lady Vane's lips trembled. "This is absurd. I barely knew the young man, but you contributed generously to his architectural projects," Miss Marple continued relentlessly. "Anonymous donations, carefully channeled through intermediaries. I verified this with his office in London. You followed his career closely, and when you learned he was engaged to Victoria Ashworth, you couldn't bear it. You began writing the letters. Craddock took up the narrative, using your knowledge of the old scandal to torment him, to make him doubt himself and his decisions. You told yourself you were helping him, showing him the truth about Victoria's lies. But really, you were trying to bind him to you through shared secrets and dependence. And when that didn't work," Miss Marple said softly, "when Gerald decided to go through with the marriage anyway, you couldn't accept it. You sent him a final letter, asking him to meet you at the church before the ceremony. You promised him proof of Victoria's deception, evidence that would free him. But when he came to you, I didn't mean to kill him." Lady Vane burst out suddenly, her composure cracking. "I only meant to talk to him, to make him see reason." But he was angry, so angry. He said I had made his life a misery with my letters, that he'd rather marry Victoria and take his chances than spend another moment living in fear of my revelations. He said, she broke off, tears streaming down her face. He said he pitied me, she whispered. Pitied me, as if I were some pathetic old woman obsessed with a fantasy. He turned to leave, to go through with that farce of a wedding, and I picked up the candlestick. I didn't think. I just wanted to stop him from walking away, from dismissing everything I'd done for him. The candlestick was heavy, and when it struck his head, she swayed, and Mrs. Price Ridley moved to support her. He fell so quickly, Lady Vane continued, her voice hollow. There was blood. I panicked. I couldn't leave him there where he'd be found immediately. So I dragged him to the crypti. Knew about it because I'd funded the historical survey of the church. The stone was heavy, but fear and desperation make one strong. I hid him there, cleaned up the blood as best I could, and then I ran outside and created those marks by the river. His watch eye found it on the floor of the church, hid it in the organ loft, meaning to dispose of it later, but with all the confusion. I couldn't get back to retrieve it. Inspector Craddock had been signalling to his constables, who now moved to flank Lady Vane. Lady Henrietta Vane, I'm arresting you for the murder of Gerald Pemberton, as the constables led her away. Still weeping, Yes, though I wonder if it would have been happy, Miss Marple mused. Gerald was trapped between Victoria's deception and Lady Vane's obsession. He was going through with a marriage he didn't want, to a woman who had manipulated him into proposing, while being tormented by a blackmailer whose identity he couldn't determine. His life had become a web of lies and fear. Does that excuse what Lady Vane did? Miss Pinkerton demanded. Of course not. Murder is never excusable. But understanding the circumstances helps us see how such tragedies occur. Lady Vane loved Gerald in her way, but it was a selfish, possessive love that sought to control rather than cherish. When she couldn't have him on her terms, she destroyed him. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Craddock, who had come to thank Miss Marple formally for her assistance. You were right about everything, he said, accepting a cup of tea from Mrs. Clement. Lady Vane has made a full confession. She's also provided the original blackmail letters she wrote. She kept copies, if you can believe it. Some sort of twisted keepsake. Has she expressed any remorse? Miss Marple asked. Some, though it's complicated. She keeps insisting she was trying to help Gerald, to save him from a disastrous marriage. She claims she never meant to kill him, that it was an accident born of passion. But the concealment of the body, the staging of the evidence that wasn't accidental. No, indeed. Her legal counsel will argue temporary insanity, I expect, given her age and the circumstances. But the premeditation, evident in her blackmail scheme, will make that difficult to prove. What about Victoria Ashworth? Mrs. Price Ridley asked. Will she face charges for her deception? Craddock shook his head. No crime was committed. She lied to her father and to Gerald, certainly, But lying isn't illegal unless it's done under oath or for financial gain. She'll have to live with the consequences of her actions, the scandal, the shame, the knowledge that her lies contributed to Gerald's death. Is she still at Ashworth Hall? For now. Though I understand the Colonel is sending her to stay with relatives in Scotland until the worst of the gossip dies down. Poor girl, she's utterly devastated. Whatever her faults, I don't believe she wanted anyone to die. Miss Marple nodded. No, she wanted a fairy tale romance. She saw Gerald as a prize to be won, not a person with his own agency and feelings. Like Lady Vane, she tried to force love rather than allowing it to develop naturally. Both women paid a terrible price for that arrogance. The gathering gradually dispersed, with Miss Marple receiving thanks and praise from all quarters for her role in solving the mystery. But she deflected the compliments with her usual modesty. I simply observed human nature, as I always do, she told the vicar as she prepared to leave. People are remarkably consistent in their behaviors. Once you've lived as long as I have, and observed as carefully, patterns begin to emerge. Still, your insight was remarkable. Without your observations about Lady Vane, the case might never have been solved. Oh, I think Inspector Craddock would have reached the same conclusion eventually. I simply helped speed the process along. As Miss Marple walked home, she encountered Timothy Carr, who was preparing to return to London. He stopped when he saw her, his face drawn but composed. Miss Marple, I wanted to thank you. Gerald was my closest friend, and knowing what really happened, knowing that justice will be served, brings some small comfort. I'm glad I could help. Mr. Carr, though I'm sorry for your loss. It's all so senseless, isn't it? Gerald died because two women couldn't accept reality. Victoria couldn't accept that he didn't love her, and Lady Vane couldn't accept that her love would never be returned. If either of them had just let him be, he'd be alive, yes. But we can't change the past. Mr. Carr, we can only learn from it and try to do better. After Carr departed, Miss Marple continued her walk, stopping at the village shop to purchase some stamps and exchange pleasantries with the shopkeeper, who was bursting with gossip about the case. They're saying Lady Vane will hang, the shopkeeper said with morbid excitement. A titled lady on the gallows, it's unprecedented. Let's not be hasty, Miss Marple said mildly. The courts haven't made their determination yet, and whatever Lady Vane's crimes, she's still a human being deserving of compassion. After what she did to that poor young man, after what she did, yes. Understanding evil doesn't mean excusing it, but it does mean remembering that even those who commit terrible acts are still human. Lady Vane's life is effectively over, regardless of whether she faces the death penalty. That's punishment enough, I should think, at home. Miss Marple found a letter waiting for her from Mrs. Pemberton. It was brief but heartfelt. Dear Miss Marple, I write to express my deepest gratitude for your role in discovering the truth about my son's death. While knowing the circumstances brings pain, it also brings closure. We can now mourn Gerald properly and lay him to rest with dignity. I hope you will not judge me too harshly for my initial suspicions. I was so certain that Victoria was involved, and I let my dislike of her cloud my judgment. You showed me that the truth is often more complex than our prejudices allow. If you are ever in London, please do call upon me. I would be honoured to receive you. With sincere thanks. Eleanor Pemberton. Miss Marple set the letter aside with a small smile. It was gratifying to be appreciated, though she had never solved mysteries for praise or recognition. She did it because justice mattered, because truth mattered. And and because every murder victim deserved to have their story told and their killer brought to account, she spent the remainder of the afternoon in her garden, tending to her roses and reflecting on the case. The essential facts were clear now, the mystery solved, but questions of morality and human nature lingered. What made someone like Lady Vane cross the line from admiration to obsession? At what point did love become possession? How did otherwise respectable people convince themselves that manipulation and even murder were justified? These were questions without simple answers. Miss Marple had spent a lifetime observing human behavior, and she knew that the capacity for both great good and great evil existed in everyone. The difference lay in choices, the daily decisions to act with integrity rather than selfishness, to respect others' autonomy rather than trying to control them. Lady Vane had made the wrong choices, repeatedly, until she found herself in a position where murder seemed like the only option. Victoria Ashworth had made wrong choices too, though her deceptions had been driven by foolish romanticism rather than dark obsession. And Gerald Pemberton, he had been passive, allowing himself to be manipulated by Victoria's lies and controlled by Lady Vane's blackmail. Perhaps if he had been more assertive, more willing to face difficult truths and make hard decisions, he might still be alive. But Miss Marple didn't blame the victim. Gerald had been young, idealistic, and fundamentally decent. Those very qualities had made him vulnerable to the predations of women, who saw him as an object to be possessed rather than a person to be respected. As the sun began to set over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across Miss Marple's garden, she set down her gardening tools and went inside. Tomorrow would bring new routines, new conversations, new observations of human nature in all its complexity. But tonight she would rest, satisfied that justice had been served, and that one small corner of the world had been set right again. 3 months later, St. Mary Mead had largely returned to its usual rhythms, though the events of that terrible September had left their mark on the community. The church services proceeded as normal, the village shops did their usual business, and life moved forward with the resilience typical of English country villages. Miss Marple sat in her garden on a chilly December afternoon, wrapped in a warm shawl and working on her knitting, when the Reverend Clement stopped by with news. "I thought you'd want to know," he said, settling into the garden chair beside her. Lady Vane's trial concluded yesterday. She was found guilty of murder, but the judge showed mercy given her age and the circumstances. Life imprisonment rather than death. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. "I see. And how does the village feel about that verdict?" "Mixed opinions, as you might imagine. Some feel she deserved hanging for what she did. Others believe life imprisonment is appropriate. She's 62 years old. After all, she'll likely die in prison regardless. And what do you think, Vicar?" Clement sighed. "I think justice has been served, though it's a sad sort of justice. No one wins in this case. Gerald is dead. Victoria's reputation is destroyed. Lady Vane will spend her remaining years in prison, and the families are shattered. It's all quite tragic. Yes, but necessary. Crimes must have consequences, or society breaks down entirely." "You're quite right, of course." Clement paused, then added, "I had a letter from Colonel Ashworth last week. He's sold Ashworth Hall and is moving to Scotland permanently. He says he can't bear to remain in a place with so many painful memories. And Victoria, living with relatives near Edinburgh. Apparently, she's taken a position as a governess, using an assumed name. She wants to build a new life away from the scandal. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. That shows character. She made terrible mistakes, but she's trying to move forward with dignity. I hope she succeeds. Mrs. Pemberton and Sarah have also left London, Clement continued. They've taken a cottage in Cornwall. Mrs. Pemberton wrote to thank me for my support during the investigation. She seems to be finding some peace, though the loss of her son will never fully heal. No, it won't. But time helps. And knowing the truth, understanding what really happened, that helps too. They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, watching the December sun sink lower in the sky. The garden was dormant now, preparing for winter's sleep. But Miss Marple could already envision the spring bulbs she'd planted pushing through the earth when the weather warmed. You know, Clement said thoughtfully, this entire affair has made me reconsider how we see people. Lady Vane was so respected, so admired. She donated generously to the church, participated in village affairs, seemed to embody all the virtues we value. Yet beneath that respectable exterior lurked obsession and violence. Human beings are complex creatures, Miss Marple agreed. We all wear masks of one sort or another. The difference is that most of us don't use those masks to hide murderous intentions. How did you see through hers? What made you suspect her when everyone else saw only a dignified benefactor? Miss Marple considered this question carefully. Small inconsistencies, mainly. Her reaction when Gerald disappeared was wrong somehow. Too controlled, too expectant. Then there was the button which placed her in the garden when she claimed to be inside the church. The handwriting on the flower arrangement schedules matched descriptions of the blackmail letters. And most tellingly, her behavior after Gerald's body was found. She showed no real grief, only a sort of grim satisfaction, as if a problem had been solved. You have a remarkable gift for observation. Not remarkable, simply practiced. I've spent many years watching people, Vicar. I've learned to notice the small things that reveal character. A glance, a gesture, a tone of voice, these tell more truth than words ever can. After Clement departed, Miss Marple received another visitor, Inspector Craddock, who had become something of a friend through their collaboration on the case. I was in the area visiting family and thought I'd stop by, he said, accepting her offer of tea. I wanted to thank you again for your assistance. The Yard has officially commended me for solving the case, though we both know you deserve most of the credit. Nonsense, Inspector. You would have reached the same conclusion, perhaps, but it would have taken considerably longer. Your insights about Lady Vane's psychology were invaluable. He paused, then added, I've been thinking about what you said during the investigation, about how the most dangerous people are often those who believe they're acting from noble motives. It's true, isn't it? Lady Vane convinced herself she was protecting Gerald, saving him from an unworthy marriage. That self-deception allowed her to justify increasingly terrible actions. If she'd simply acknowledged that her motives were selfish, that she wanted Gerald for herself, she might have recognized the wrongness of her behavior and stopped before it escalated to murder. And Victoria Ashworth told herself she was securing her future with the man she loved, rather than admitting she was trapping him through deception. Exactly. Self-deception is one of humanity's most dangerous traits. We're remarkably adept at justifying our worst actions by recasting them as virtuous or necessary. Craddock stirred his tea thoughtfully. This case has affected how I approach investigations. I'm more attentive now to psychology, to the stories people tell themselves about their actions. Facts and evidence matter, of course, but understanding, motivation, and self-deception can be equally important. I'm glad you've learnt something valuable from this tragedy. That at least gives it some meaning. They talked for another hour, discussing other cases and comparing observations about human nature. When Craddock finally departed, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, feeling satisfied with the afternoon's conversations. As Christmas approached, the village gradually shed its association with the murder. New gossip emerged. Mrs. Price Ridley's niece had become engaged. Young Dr. Griffin had taken over part of Dr. Haydock's practice. The vicar was considering renovations to the church hall. Life, as it always did, moved forward. Miss Marple attended Christmas services and was pleased to note that the church was full, the congregation having overcome its discomfort with the building's dark history. The Reverend Clement delivered a sermon on redemption and forgiveness that was universally praised for its wisdom and compassion. After the service, Miss Marple walked home through the crisp winter air, reflecting on the year that had passed. The murder of Gerald Pemberton had been a terrible thing, but it had also revealed important truths about human nature, truths that, while uncomfortable, were valuable to understand. People were capable of great deception, both of others and themselves. Love could twist into obsession, admiration could curdle into possession, and desperation could lead to violence. But people were also capable of growth, learning, and recovery. Victoria Ashworth was rebuilding her life with integrity. The Pemberton family was finding peace. The village had weathered the scandal and emerged stronger. These were the patterns Miss Marple had observed throughout her long life: darkness and light, sin and redemption, tragedy and resilience. Human nature encompassed all of these things, an understanding that complexity was the key to comprehending both the best and worst of which people were capable. As she settled into her favorite chair that evening, her knitting in her lap and a cup of cocoa beside her, Miss Marple felt a deep contentment. The world was full of mysteries, both large and small, and human behavior provided endless fascination for those who knew how to observe carefully. Tomorrow would bring new puzzles to ponder, new behaviors to analyze, new insights into the endlessly complex tapestry of human nature. But tonight, in the quiet comfort of her cottage, Miss Marple was simply grateful for justice served, for truth revealed, and for the peaceful rhythms of village life that continued season after season. Despite the occasional intrusion of violence and tragedy, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across the room. Outside, snow began to fall, covering St. Mary Mead in a blanket of white that seemed to promise fresh beginnings and clean slates. Miss Marple picked up her knitting needles and began to work, her hands moving with the practiced ease of long experience. The clicking of the needles provided a steady rhythm, soothing and familiar, as reliable as the turning of the seasons and the unchanging nature of human hearts. And somewhere in that rhythm was a quiet satisfaction, another mystery solved, another truth uncovered, another small victory for justice in a world that too often seemed chaotic and incomprehensible. But not to Miss Marple. To her keen eyes and understanding heart, human nature was an open book. Its pages worn but legible, its stories endlessly varied yet fundamentally familiar, and she would continue to read those stories, to observe those patterns, for as long as her eyes remained sharp and her mind remained clear, because that was what she did. That was who she was. Miss Jane Marple, observer of human nature, solver of mysteries, and guardian of truth in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead.